Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself first?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Sara Lynch. I'm a staff attorney at Community Legal Services, and I'm looking forward to talking about this topic.
And I'm Richard Weishaupt, also an attorney at Community Legal Services, and I see a lot of familiar names and some not so familiar names, but it's great to have you all here. And we're going to talk about a very important subject, especially for people who are doing disability advocacy, namely COVID-19, and especially the what are called long haulers. So can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so Social Security is just starting to adapt to the question of how to evaluate what has happened with COVID, particularly for those who are long haulers. A lot of the people who have contracted COVID have recovered or tragically passed away. But now what's being faced is the long haul, and it seems that a lot, as we're going to talk about, a lot of the results of having gotten COVID, and not everybody gets these long haul conditions, but about a third of the population that have gotten COVID infection are experiencing long haul things. Some things not so bad. A number of them very bad.
Richard, can you explain what you mean by long haulers?
Sure. Long haulers are basically people who've gotten symptoms as a result of their bout with COVID-19. At one point they tested positive, or a doctor or other healthcare professional diagnosed them as having COVID-19 infection. And some of those people were very, very sick. Other people, not quite so much. And some people in the middle. But now what we're experiencing is that, or the medical profession is seeing, is that a lot of people that were in that first group are now getting secondary symptoms, some of which are very bad.
And can you share a little bit about what Social Security's response has been so far?
Well, that's the next slide, which is bewilderment, to put it kindly. A while ago, and that's the first link that you've got here, and you'll all be getting a copy of the PowerPoint, so you can get to that whenever you need to. So there was a first emergency memo, and that's this one, and it's basically saying flag all of the cases where people have applied for disability, and say that one of their disabling conditions is COVID-19 infection. And that's the instruction here, is to just flag those cases so that when Social Security gets back to figuring out what's going on, they can pull those cases up and apply whatever new policies they've developed. In the end of April, Social Security put out its first policy statement beyond flag all the cases. And that's this emergency message that I think is the one that's, that Sarah's pulled up now. So we'll come back to this. There are, just so that you can see, basically, they're telling us that to deal with severity, Duration was a big deal at first. As you probably know, in order for something to be disabling as a condition under the Social Security Act, it has to be an impairment, a medically defined impairment that will last for at least a year or result in death. And that year-long thing was one thing that Social Security started to struggle with. They've now conceded the fact that people with these long-haul problems, they will consider those to be meeting the duration requirement of the act. Just to give you a sense of the kind of numbers that we're dealing with, you probably have seen this on television or in the newspapers. Nationally, there have been 33 million people who've been infected by the virus, which is about 10% of the population in the United States. And more than 500,000, 590,320 people have died from this scourge. In Pennsylvania, just to give you a sense of those numbers in our state, more than 1 million cases of COVID have been reported. 1.2 million people, which is about 10% of the Pennsylvania population, have had COVID and tested positive for it. And 27,000 people have died tragically from this. And as you probably know, a disproportionate number of people of color have been affected by this. Low-income people have also been particularly affected. And finally, people with pre-existing conditions are particularly at risk and have suffered pretty greatly. So the question that we were talking about and what we're going to talk about today is whether COVID is disabling under the Social Security Act. And Social Security has acknowledged that is possible. Not only can COVID have fatal results, usually pretty quickly after it's been contracted, but there are also these long-term effects, and that's what we're going to talk about mostly today. And they can preclude, I would argue, as I'm sure you would, can preclude the ability to work, to perform substantial gainful activity. So what are the legal challenges that we face in trying to represent this enormous population of people who've contracted this illness? Well, one thing is duration. I think even though the emergency memo has conceded that duration is possible, I wouldn't be surprised if some ALJs give people a hard time, especially on mental health issues, and we'll get back to those later. The other thing that's very challenging is, like the AIDS, if there are people that were practicing legal services back when the AIDS epidemic first broke out, which includes at least me, in terms of being around for that, but I'm sure there's some others as well. The Social Security didn't know what to make of it at first. It didn't help that we had a president who refused to say the word AIDS. Fortunately, we now have a president who has a very different look on COVID. But Social Security is a little bit on the slow side in acknowledging this. There are no listed impairments that specifically address COVID, and that probably won't happen for quite some time. Hopefully we can push them along to do that more quickly. And without a listing, it's as we're going to see, it can be problematic. There are listings that have similar conditions that can be helpful, but there's no listing where you can just turn to your listings and find COVID as one of the areas where they have them.
Before
Let's
get to
go.
listings, yeah, before we get to listings, I heard that people who have had experienced long haul symptoms found relief once they got the vaccine. So would the vaccine just solve the problem and people will be cured?
Well, that's actually the last bullet on this slide. I talked about in terms of hurdles. One of them is the myths, and of course, everybody, including if they have ALJ after their name, seem to think that they know everything. That concept that, oh, if you get the vaccination, you'll be fine and everything will go away. That's true for some people, but it's not true for most people. So yes, people should get vaccinations. They can get it. If they don't, they can wind up with getting it again. And it may tone down some of the conditions that they're experiencing. So it's certainly advisable to get it. But it is important to remember that that's really just a myth. So some people are going to have these long haul conditions that are going to come, like, for example, loss of taste and loss of the sense of smell. Those tend to be temporary. But there are other things where you could get, for example, problems with blood clotting. And that may result in the blood you may not have the blood clotting for the rest of your life, but the problem can be that the blood clotting can cause a stroke, and a stroke will mean that the brain is not getting adequate blood circulation, and that the damage that a stroke causes is permanent. If you get brain damage, you might get somewhat better. The brain can adapt, but for most people, there's going to be at least some, and oftentimes a great deal of damage to the brain. And there's similar kinds of things in other conditions where there's permanent damage done by COVID. So here are some of here's what the CDC has identified as the long-term COVID symptoms. And you'll see that this is just a quote from the CDC. Long-term COVID is a range of symptoms that can last weeks or months after first being infected with the virus that causes COVID-19, or can appear weeks after the infection. Long COVID can happen to anyone who has had COVID-19, even if the illness was mild or that they had no symptoms whatsoever. There are asymptomatic people that suddenly get these long haul conditions. People with long COVID report experience a variety of these symptoms: tiredness or fatigue, difficulty thinking or concentrating, sometimes referred as brain fog, headaches, loss of smell or taste, we talked about that, dizziness on standing, chest pain, largely due to cardiological problems, difficulty breathing or shortness of breath, coughing, fast beating or pounding hearts, also known as heart palpitations, joint or muscle pain, depression or anxiety, fever, and symptoms that may get worse, and symptoms that can get worse after physical or mental activities. So if you're lifting and carrying the prosaic 10 or 20 pounds that Social Security is apt to find for many people, those kinds of efforts could very easily tire you out in a way that you never had a problem with before. Okay. Any questions about that, by the way?
We don't have any questions in the chat, and I think we're going to get to this later, but I have questions about, like, okay, so how do you prove, dizziness, and at what level will dizziness make a difference in your case? And I know we're going to talk about that later because I've seen these slides already, but just keeping it in mind for folks, that Richard's going to give more of the background about COVID's effect on the body, and then we'll begin to talk about practical tips to build a record and make your case.
Oh, and I didn't give you the final version, Sarah, just so that, that I was trying to trick you.
Yeah, that was a surprise.
So one of the things that they talk about is that you can have multi-organ effects from COVID. COVID is, the virus causes inflammation to the body, and it attacks various organs, and it attaches them to those organs, and they cause a great deal of inflammation and blood clotting and all sorts of mischief that creates damage and then has secondary damages. Like, for example, when it starts to damage the blood system, and then all of a sudden the person gets damage to various organs, which can be the brain, it can be the kidney, it can be lots of different organs. And so that's one of the reasons why we talk about these multi-system inflammatory syndromes. So these can cause any number of problems, and they usually affect cardiology, heart, all sorts of heart conditions, pulmonary problems, which is, of course, your lungs, renal problems, which is the kidney, and they can damage the brain, and those tend to be neurological problems. And then there's also mental disorders that come both from changing the brain, but also affecting the way that people that their mental health is manifested. One thing that I read very recently that I just didn't think of it is that a lot of people who lose their sense of taste or smell get PTSD because there aren't a whole lot of jobs that require smell or taste, I guess, unless you're a wine taster. But it's such a fundamental portion of the way that we live and that we take pleasure from, for example, eating, that when people lose those senses, it's like a trauma that can actually cause PTSD.
We didn't discuss this before, so sorry if I'm throwing you off a little bit, but this is making me think of a little bit of the obesity guidance, where Social Security acknowledges that people who have obesity are affected in other areas, both like exertionally or in terms of their mental health. So do you see similarities there? Is that helpful? Is it not?
Yeah, and we'll talk more about that later. And the maddening thing is Social Security will concede it, but a lot of their adjudicators don't really see it. I deal a lot with cases involving sickle cell and lupus, for example, both of which, among other things, cause a great deal of fatigue. But it's such a hard thing to explain to an adjudicator that the person is experiencing fatigue that prevents them from being able to work, because there's no such thing as a fatigueometer, where they can just put you up and say, oh, look, there's 4.5 in the fatigue score. So and it's largely a question of people's reports. Now, obesity is a little different, but it's still, the obesity actually causes limitations, and it's the patient who normally has to explain why that is.
Mm-hmm.
But so let's move on. Oops. Did we skip one, or is that the next one?
No, we're back at the listings, but I think,
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's some listings that you should be looking at to try and get a sense if you've got some medical records from the client or from the client's providers, and you start to see things, and you want to look at the listings. I like to look at the listings just to figure out how bad can it be, because normally the listings are set a pretty high hurdle, but it gives you a better sense of what the person's condition is and how it's going to be evaluated. So I put in the listings that would be most likely for you to look at. I think you should take a look at these when you get a chance. So there's the heart listings, there's the lung listings. In the lung ones, the people, it's often very helpful for people to get lung testing, PFTs, which are not terribly elaborate. That's not a hard test to get done. And the COVID can seriously affect people's lung capacity. It may not be at the listing level, but it's still such that, you can't breathe. It's pretty hard to do jobs that have physical exertion.
Would we be asking for lung, like breathing tests at CEs?
Yeah. Yes, definitely. And we will talk more about CEs. So the other thing is that, well, we skipped ahead. Can we go back to the listings? Thanks. Mm-hmm. So look at them at the kidney scores. Also, neurology is going to be very tricky. There is clearly brain damage that is caused by COVID. The challenge is going to be a lot of the most tricky and expensive testing that's being done is something that is neuropsych evaluations. Social Security, at least up until now, for as long as I've been doing this, refuses to pay for neuropsych testing. A PFT thing blow into this, and we'll measure the force of oxygen that you're capable of blowing out. That's pretty cheap. Social Security will pay for those, just like Sara was asking about. Neurology, I mean, if you can get somebody kind of neuropsych testing, please try to do that, because that's one area where you can actually test for things and see whether there's been any brain damage. But frankly, that's not going to be easy. And none of their CEs will do those. Mental disorders, that's probably the area that you're most familiar with. And you particularly want to look at some of these particular listings. 12.02 is cognitive impairments. 12.04 is depression. I can't remember what 12.06 is. And 12.15 is PTSD, trauma related. So take a look at those, see if they fit. And I'm sure that's probably an area where you're pretty comfortable with dealing with it. A lot of people, just go back for 1 second. That in the emergency memo that we saw briefly, Social Security has said, well, there aren't exactly the same as the cardiology listing or the pulmonary listing, but we can make a determination based on it equals the listing. Maybe you don't come quite to the objective scoring that they have, but and demand in the listing, but they can say, well, 7 is the same as 7.5 in some score. The problem with equaling is that Social Security says that only a doctor can do equaling, and only a doctor that they hire. So you can't even make an argument to the judge and say, well, John here equals a particular listing, and the judge is going to say, I'm not allowed to make an equals decision without consulting with a doctor, and you'll notice I didn't get a doctor here. So one of the things we're going to talk about later on is trying to get them to order medical experts. I think the whole business about the way that they treat equivalence is ridiculous, but it's the ridiculous situation that we've been stuck with for years and years.
And would that help to set you up for an appeal if they didn't ask for one, or do you have to make the request prior to the hearing?
Both. Better late than never, but the early bird catches the worm. So I'm just giving you all these prosaic things that I don't know what they mean. But yeah, the sooner you can ask for that, the better. The other thing that we're gonna talk about later, but I'll do a little spoiler alert here, is you really want to encourage people to see doctors and clinics that are pretty sophisticated. The treatment of COVID at this point is something that not all doctors know. And frankly, if you want to get the kind of testing that will be helpful, it would be ideal if you're talking to people who are dealing with hospitals and specialists who are pretty cutting edge. We'll talk more about that. And I know that that's not always possible. Okay, here's some Social Security rulings that may be more helpful than the listings themselves. One is there's a ruling for chronic fatigue, which is caused by Guillain-Barré virus, which is very similar to COVID-19. And I think it's possible that people can get chronic fatigue syndrome from COVID, and that's that. And these rulings, I don't know how familiar you are with them, but they're much more helpful and realistic about how to evaluate symptoms and how to adjudicate particular conditions. Fibromyalgia is another one. Headaches is also headache complaints are very common among long haulers, and Social Security only very recently put out this one for headaches because they had never had any kind of a listing or any way to evaluate headaches until they put out this ruling. You definitely want to take a look at it.
Can you explain why chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia and headaches have Social Security rulings versus a listing, and just a little bit about how those cases are analyzed?
No. If I knew why they did that, rulings are like, it's like what they do, and it's like, yeah, we should probably say something, but we're kind of skeptical about this. And so sometimes they have some conditions, they have actually a listing, like for example, sickle cell.
Mm-hmm.
But the standards for the rulings for sickle cell, for example, are so difficult to reach.
Mm-hmm.
That they got so much flack that they put out a ruling on sickle cell that's more realistic.
Yeah.
And it talks more about the process than it does about you need a score of X or Y.
Mm-hmm.
These are more process related. They can be very helpful in terms of the advocate thinking about, well, like, what do I need to ask the client about? What do I want to point to in the evidence that will prove these kinds of things? And it can be very helpful, and it can also be something that you can nag the judge with and just say, you really need to be thinking about these things.
Yeah.
Um,
My limited understanding too was that chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia are symptoms based, and are not going to show up on like a blood test or.
Well, the chronic fatigue will show up in terms of a person having Guillain-Barré viruses. But yes, I mean, yes and no. It's partly there, but partly not there. Fibromyalgia, you're right. I mean, fibromyalgia is very hard to deal with. I mean, there's nothing. It's one of those diagnoses where after they've eliminated everything else, then they say, well, there must be fibromyalgia. Okay, so here are some things that you want to look out for.
And before we get into that, I think Kelly is going to launch one of the polls.
Okay.
Sarah, for attorneys participating on the session today, you should have just received a little pop-up box on your screen with a yes or no question. Please respond with yes or no. Both will qualify you for CLE credit for your participation today. I will leave this up for 2 minutes, and the second poll box will be launched later in the training. And sharing poll results. Okay, I'm not sure what's happening with that. If you weren't able or didn't have time to respond to that, just send me a message in the chat box. I'm not sure why it closed down so quickly. So thanks, and please continue, Sarah and Rich.
Thank you.
I think Richard and we're not clicking on that, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, you don't have to. I've got you covered.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, so going back to the PowerPoint, so at this one, I think we're going to start to talk about like step 5.
Pragmatic stuff.
So how do you establish that that person their COVID symptoms or long haul symptoms will affect them at steps 4 and 5?
Yeah, I mean, let's assume that a client comes in and says, my doctor says that I have long haul COVID conditions, and yeah, and here's the records, and I go to Jefferson Hospital, and you get some stuff, but it's helpful. But here are some of the things that you want to establish as much as you possibly can, and ultimately you're going to be thinking about, okay, how am I going to prove this at step 5? How am I going to prove that with these conditions, this person could not do substantial gainful activity? So here are some things to look for. The likelihood of absenteeism. And you would want to ask the client, how many bad days do you have? Okay, so you've got these headaches. How often do you have the headaches, and what can you do? And the person says, well, I don't know, maybe every other day of the week. And on those days, I can't function at all. All I can do is lie in bed with the shades down and with no noise, and my family knows to leave me alone for like at least 4 hours. Well, you want to get all of that on the record, and because obviously you're not describing someone who, if you got that kind of testimony and it's believed, that would preclude, I would argue, that would preclude that you couldn't possibly work. Some other things, loss of focus and brain fog. Again, it's subjective, but the brain fog, interestingly enough, is something that doctors are pretty comfortable with understanding that and noting it in the records. especially in like the last 4 or 5 years, you start to see that. But you still need, it's a subjective condition. There's no fogometer. You've got to elicit it from the client, and ideally you'd get something from the doctor or from or a social worker or a nurse or a family member can say, you know, he just complains all the time about just being in a fog. And, you know, he used to be able to do X, Y, and Z, and now it's just like he can't remember what the heck is going on for hours at a time. Bathroom breaks, that can be a problem. It's obvious, right? The COVID-19 can cause incontinence, both urinary and fecal. And you certainly want to, it's embarrassing, but it's certainly want to establish that. You know, nobody wants, if you're working on an assembly and you need to go and use the women's room or the men's room, you know, on a frequently, you can't function in that work environment. Not with the, you know, with the fact that you're expected to be there all the time, and, you know, putting the widget in the widget hole. Dwindling energy and fatigue. This is a very hard, I find fatigue cases to be among the most difficult to prove, given the skepticism of adjudicators. But you will frequently hear long haulers talking about, especially as the day goes on, they just, their energy level just goes way down. You know, they do something that normally they would have done with no problems, and all of a sudden, you know, they get this problem, and, you know, by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they're spent. And so they definitely, that would definitely preclude in gainful employment. Shortness of breath, same kind of obvious problems, and can cause the fatigue if you can't breathe all the time. Some other things, for some reason, intolerance of noise and certainly pulmonary irritants can be major problems in terms of restricting the kinds of jobs that you could possibly do. You know, you're not going to be able to be a painter anymore if, you know, you can't be around pulmonary irritants, because, you know, paints and turpentine are irritants. The other thing that can come as a result of neurological problems is loss of balance, which then precludes you being able to work at heights or around dangerous machinery, because, you know, if you move and, you know, you come up against dangerous machinery, you're going to be injured, and that's going to be the end of you. Definitely want to be on a lookout for the problems with balance, which affects an awful lot of jobs that you need to be, especially if they involve physical exertion. POTS is a relatively new diagnosis that you see a lot of, and a lot of people get diagnosed with this as a result of COVID long haul symptoms.
I'll say to add to that, for those of you practicing at the initial and recon level, which I encourage everyone to do, and is my main practice. Some of the ways that we establish consistency of symptoms is to submit multiple function reports at the beginning of a case, and we ask clients questions about these areas if they have these symptoms, to establish that, and we'll submit multiple function reports. We'll ask for third-party reports, and we've been starting to do diaries with our clients who have long-term symptoms, that good days and bad days. And since if you're working with someone at recon and initial, you're getting to know them over a series of months, and you can begin to get you can begin to back up what's going to be their testimony with months worth of evidence. So, just a thought.
One thing that along the same lines is if I know that people have balance problems, I'll look for minor injuries. How did you get I see that on March 17th, you went to the doctor's office and complaining of a knee abrasion. What happened? Oh, I lost my balance and fell. And then I see another one in April, and you got a gash in your head. How did that happen? I fell down the stairs when I was putting it down the laundry. Those kinds of things. I mean, they're not indicative of disabling, of disability itself. I mean, a scratch, a bang in the head, not pleasant, but they're not disabling, but they indicate that you've got serious balance problems. Because people don't throw themselves down the stairs usually for fun. I hardly ever do that. Okay.
So what about more practice tips?
Sorry?
So what about some more practice tips? That's one of establishing symptoms over time. But what else should people be thinking about in terms of practice?
Well, here are some tips. I'm glad you asked that question. So encourage people to see specialists, especially neurologists and psychiatrists affiliated with research institutions. I think that we're going to see a lot of cases with COVID ramifications. And frankly, there a lot of providers are not going to be the right people to make those kinds of diagnoses. I have a lot of clients, and as I'm sure a lot of you do, who go to community mental health places, and they can be very good, but I don't think that they're going to be equipped for the most part unless they start having a special clinic. I don't think that they're going to have the wherewithal to make those kinds of definitions, diagnoses, and saying, there's something wrong going on here, and we think it's related to his COVID problems or her COVID problems. So I know that people frequently have relationships with providers that can be very understandable, but I think that if there's both in terms of their health and in terms of their disability case, I think it's important for them to see a different level of providers who may not need to see them, like every week, but they do need a certain level of sophistication. I think that's also true, by the way, of some of the CEs that Social Security tends to send them to. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Like Sara said, I encourage clients to use a tracker or a journal or a diary. One thing that I didn't know existed, but I was at a conference yesterday and found out that there are all these free apps where you can just download them on your iPhone or your the other phone. Not a real techie. There's a apparently everybody says that this thing called Bearable, it's free, and allows you to keep track of your symptoms for a whole variety of kind of chronic illnesses. So it can be handy for a lot of other things, as well as long-term COVID problems. And sure enough, I went on my iPhone this morning, and I just typed in, Tracker's COVID free app, and I got a ton of them. And a lot of people have cell phones these days, and they're more comfortable with, frankly, dealing with their phone than they are with the notebook that you give them. I mean, if they're comfortable with the notebook, great, but this is another possibility. And the nice thing is most people have their cell phone with them all the time these days. The other thing is, I would suggest that, especially in these days of phone hearings or interviews, you really want to get family members to write written statements. And you can certainly do that at the application and the recon level as well. Get those statements in. Ask for third party evaluations. Yeah, Rich used to be really very agile, but all of a sudden he's just bumping into things and he can never remember, where he put his keys or anything else. Those are the kinds of things that a family member would notice that add a great deal to terms of credibility. And the doctor isn't going to know that because the doctor is going to see them for, 20 minutes, and they'll just, at best, they're going to record what the client tells them. And a lot of times clients don't tell them. Or the client did tell them, but they didn't write it down. So it's really essential to try to get those third parties to write those kind of statements wherever possible. I be careful with CEs. I have a feeling that we're going to see the PsyDs that with IMA seems to be in love with, who seem to think that they've never seen a marked impairment in anything. And I have a feeling it's going to be even worse when they're dealing with something that they don't know anything about. So I would try to resist CEs, or, I would try asking either the judge or the adjudicator. It's like, this is a very new area, and why don't you ask the specialist that he or she sees? Why don't you ask that person to be the ME, to be the CE? It's provided in the POMs. It's provided in the regulations. There's no reason they can't do it other than the fact that IMA doesn't want those people very much. But I think that it's having somebody who knows what's going on is a lot better than, sending, a male client to an OBGYN or, that knows nothing about COVID problems. And I'm particularly thinking about one person that they send them to a lot of the time. And I think it's worth a shot. And then the other thing is, if you do know that a CE is coming and you're not terribly impressed by this particular CE, now's the time to start thinking about whether you can possibly get a more sophisticated doctor to write a different evaluation, because you're not going to get a very good evaluation, or at best you're not going to get a useful evaluation. The other thing, and this is more to the hearing level, ask for a medical expert. Especially if you're trying to establish equivalence, you have to have a medical expert there. And I would, if you've got somebody who would say a kidney problem as a result of COVID, you can say, Judge, this person clearly has a kidney problem. The question is whether that kidney problem is equal to, listing, 6.5. And the only way we're going to be able to make that determination is if you get a medical expert there. And I would put that request in writing, and with as much explanation as you can possibly get, not just to persuade the judge, but also to be looking down the line, because we don't know what the policy of Social Security is going to look like in 6 months or a year. And it would be awfully helpful if you'd said, we asked for an expert, and you clearly now realize that experts are really essential. but this judge did not refuse to have an ME, so we need a new hearing. And I think that kind of thing happened all the time during the early days of the AIDS epidemic. And the people who did those kinds of prophylactic kind of requests found rewards for their clients. It's tedious, and it's way down the line, and obviously winning right away is even better. But we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we do damage control if you think that maybe you are not going to win, despite how persuasive you are. Okay. Look for and highlight objective evidence. There's a lot of the problems that you see in these long haul lists are not objective. So to the extent that there's objective evidence, highlight it. And if there's a possibility, like one thing that is not the most fun testing is EMGs, where they look to see how your nerves are getting signals from the brain. It's not the most pleasant test in the world. I have had them, and it's not the greatest thing in the entire world. And your client may not be eager to do it, but if they're offered it, and obviously it's their call, but it might very well be a good idea to do, and I would encourage them and basically say, well, your doctor wouldn't be suggesting this unless there was a good reason for it, and it might help your case. The other thing that I think is really important, because I think sometimes, especially in the early days of the COVID, people were getting tested, but it was a little on the disorganized side, and there were all these different tests, and this is still true. There's all these different testers, and God knows whether they're keeping good records, or if they're still in business. But if your client has tested positive and you're interviewing them, see if they still have any of the papers that says that they tested positive. I found out whether I tested positive or not, but by them sending me a text. Unfortunately, it said I wasn't positive. But I'm sure that if I had tested positive, it would have been a text saying, "Congratulations, you've tested positive." God knows how you're going to track that down as a piece of paper, but interview the client, see what you can get, and see if you can get that material to prove it before they throw it out. Okay, because it may very well be that you'll need to prove later that they tested positive for COVID, and that's why they're having all these long haul things down the line. Just a couple more tips. Look to see if your client has a pre-existing condition that may not have been. I'm looking at the creative way that I spelled asthma here. ASTYHMA. I think that may be brain fog. Sorry. These conditions may not have been all that persuasive way back when, but they're aggravating conditions. So even if someone had very mild asthma or relatively slight obesity, you certainly want to pick up those things, because those are the kind of things that would aggravate the condition and make it more likely that they're going to have further compromising their health if they started off with not such a good condition. So somebody who was even a relatively little bit of obesity, maybe they have a BMI of 28, 30, which isn't what you would call morbid obesity, that would certainly be an aggravating factor, and you would want to be able to prove that. Ditto asthma, or whatever that is that was misspelled. The other thing you want to ask about is if they had any compromising of their immune system, or interestingly enough, if they're taking steroids for treatment of something, because steroids do compromise immunity. So if you're taking prednisone for asthma, your chances are much higher that you're going to have COVID problems down the line. Don't forget trauma caused by COVID and loss of loved ones. I mean, there's an awful lot of people who've lost important people in their lives, and that can cause PTSD, especially if they have survivor guilt. I mean, it's something that you want to ask about, particularly if they're talking about the depression that they're feeling. It's also something that kids are going to be particularly prone to have, especially if they've lost a cherished family member. The other thing to look is to look for case managers and social workers who might be helpful in terms of giving you third-party statements. A lot of times these days, when you do a phone hearing, the ALJ will frequently not be particularly enamored about another person on being hooked up and participating in the phones. So my suggestion would be, if you know that you've got that kind of a judge, get a written statement and make sure and get it in the record as soon as possible, and try to get to match the statements that the client is giving with the statements that the third parties are giving. And make sure that you ask them the same things. Do you lose your keys? Well, if the case manager is saying, oh, he's always losing his keys, it would be a good idea to get somebody else to say the same thing, especially if it's true. So, okay, we're getting near the end. Children in COVID. A lot of children are asymptomatic when they test positive, and that can be good. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being asymptomatic, but not all the children that were asymptomatic to start with have a green light and will never be okay. Will never have this long haul stuff. They can actually have that even though they had no symptoms when they were first tested and came out positive. So just because, a client may say, well, I can't understand why Johnny has got this problem because he never had any symptoms. And it's like, yeah, that can happen. One thing about kids' cases that I think will make them easier is that for children, the question is, do they meet a listing, or do they have the functional equivalence of a listing? And the functional equivalence is measured by having 2 marked impairments of the 6 domains. And that's a much more realistic way of evaluating disability than a lot of adults encounter. So I would definitely encourage you to pursue these kids' cases and look at those 6 domains and see what you can get. And as a reminder, it doesn't mean if you lose your balance and if a kid is having balance problems and is falling all over the place, that might be enough to meet the moving about and manipulating objects. Even though the kid can still walk, the kid can still run, it's just that he's always bouncing into things and hitting his head and falling down. You don't need everything in a particular domain to have a marked problem in that domain. And that's a good thing to remind adjudicators of, because some of them will say, oh, he can care for himself, he brushes his teeth. And it's like, no, that's not the test. Okay, so to go back one, the last thing is that some studies that I was looking at, 50% of young people that were surveyed reported moderate to severe mental health problems. 50% of the children that they surveyed they thought that they had moderate to severe mental health problems from the experience of COVID in their neighborhood and in their family. It may not even be that they tested positive. And the other thing is COVID will exacerbate pre-existing conditions, especially for kids. So kids with ADHD, that may not have been the worst ADHD case that you've ever seen. But if the fact that they had ADHD or autism, that it can be way aggravated by the experience of COVID, both in terms of testing positive and also just living through the pandemic, and the fact that they have no social contacts, no ability to go to school, and living in the tension of a family that just has to stay in the house all the time, and their parents are constantly telling them you can't go outside because you might die. I mean, that's scary for a kid. It's true, but it's scary. Okay. So the future, trying to be a little I thought I'd try to end on an up note. Eventually, Social Security will have listings, and they'll have a better way to evaluate these things. Keep track of the cases that you have and consider appealing. Even if you don't normally do appeals, keep the case going, because if the adjudicatory climate changes and the standards are better, our experience has been when the cases that were still in the pipeline are still in the pipeline, they'll get another shot. The ones that just gave up and there was no appeal and there was no further appeal, frequently they will not get another shot. So I would certainly urge you that if you think it's legitimate, help the client file an appeals counsel brief, even if you're thinking, oh, the appeals counsel grants 8% of cases. What's the point? You're keeping the case alive. Stay abreast of new developments. The CDC is a very good source, as are medical journals and the internet. Social Security has been putting out these national disability forums. They did one in April with very impressive people talking about a lot of the manifestations of these problems. And I was looking at them just the other day, and I was thinking, gee, I found out a lot of things that I didn't know in the past. So don't be afraid to keep reading and looking for other ideas. That's how I found the thing about the phone apps, by the way. The other thing I would point out is there's an enormous amount of resources that are going into trying to understand the effects of COVID and the long haul. And so there's a lot of, I mean, I've heard a number of doctors now say, you know, I've never seen so much energy and resources being put into trying to figure out what's going on. And that's impressive. And that's something that we want to keep an eye on as well. So
I think
there's, if you have any questions, call Sara.
Yeah, I'll stop sharing the screen for question and answer. You can put questions in the chat if you prefer. Kelly, I don't know if you have another poll, or you can unmute yourselves and ask your questions. I had,
I'm sorry. I will launch the second CLE poll. Attorneys, please respond. And then Sarah, feel free to continue.
Yeah, my question, Richard, it's another unfair one because I didn't ask you before, but I've read, I don't know if I just messed up the poll, Kelly. I minused it for myself.
Nope, it's still open and going.
Okay, great. I've read a lot about like just disparities in terms of diagnosing long haulers or diagnosing POTS. And did any of that come up in your research as well about like equity concerns that we can help to mitigate in our advocacy?
Yes and no. I think, I mean, we still have the same healthcare system that we had, you know, a year ago. And we know that there's a lot of inequities in that healthcare system. And even if there's some degree of improvement in terms of sophistication in terms of this particular thing, I mean, some of the same racially based inequities, they're still out there. You know, I would just try to be a good advocate in terms of making sure that people who seem to be sick and who have a lot of symptoms that sound very concerning, I try to help them find a provider that is going to listen to those problems and treat them with respect and with knowledge. I mean, easier said than done, right? But I mean, I frequently see that people need some encouragement to pursue quality healthcare. And you know, and what I always tell them is, look, if you're not happy with the healthcare that you're getting, go somewhere else. You have a medical assistance card. You can go to any doctor in the state of Pennsylvania who takes Medicaid. You don't have to, if you don't feel that the doctor that you're dealing with is appropriate, you can go somewhere else. I mean, I'm not trying to say this doctor is no good, but you're the patient. You're the one that has to be comfortable. And if you're not comfortable, go somewhere else. I don't know. What do you think? Do you have suggestions in that area?
Nothing that I've seen be helpful, but I do see a lot of like bias particularly against younger women, in terms of like being believed about their symptoms, or for example, being a caretaker for their children being held against them. And so that's something that I'm looking forward to, like working with this group to try to work through as an advocate. And one of the ways that I that I am looking to build the record for those cases is lots of different pieces of evidence to substantiate their claims of kind of the consistency of symptoms of, for example, depression, or in terms of long COVID, whatever the variety of symptoms they're facing will be.
You know, another thing that I tell folks is, you know, we were talking about journals. It's not a bad idea to go to the doctor with, you know, the doctor's busy, the clinic can be very crowded, et cetera, et cetera. You know, write down the things that are bothering you and bring them to the clinic when you go, so you don't forget to talk about the headaches, the fatigue, you know, the nausea, whatever it is. You know, make sure that the doctor hears that. I mean, I've had clients say to me, "Oh, the doctor seems really busy and he's kind of brusque, so I just don't tell them. You know, I don't tell them how I'm really feeling. That's not good for your health, and it's certainly not good for your disability case either." So, I mean, yes, he's there, she's there to help you if they don't give the vibe that they're listening, or that they have enough time to listen to you. Either make them listen, or find somebody else. Any other questions?
I'm not seeing any in the chat. I put the Bearable app in the chat for people to see, in a recent article about long haulers that came out like 5 days ago. So timely topic, important topic. But yeah, I think that's it for questions.
Well, I just want to thank you, Rich and Sarah, for being here and for sharing this important information with us. Just as a little side note, I have to say, I cannot personally believe that Susan doesn't have a question or comment. But I like your background, Susan. So,
I was wondering, Susan, where are you? Are you in Hawaii?
oh, you're muted, Susan.
Yeah, no, I'm actually in Texas right now. I'm on the Gulf Coast.
Oh, really?
It's called State College, PA.
Oh. I was gonna say, usually people do pictures behind them. I've never seen where the trees actually move, and I kept kind of focusing on it throughout.
Yeah, it's very calming, I found. Very
It
calming.
is, it really is. The waves and the
Yeah.
breeze in the tree. So thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks, Rich and Sarah, and we will get materials out to you either today or tomorrow. Kristen, did you want to say anything?
No, I just want to say thank you to Richard and Sarah, who were excellent, and I feel like I learned a ton. And for folks who are joining us, thank you so much for coming to this series. Your kind of training team is going to be meeting early next month to figure out what our events for the summer are going to be. I know people had an interest in talking about medical records, which I think is I haven't quite wrapped my mind around how we do that in a way that's relevant for all the programs. So if folks have ideas like about how to make that session useful, even if it's like a facilitated conversation where we all chime in, or if you have other topics that you feel like you'd really get a lot out of and you'd like some CLE credit for the attorneys, definitely send me an email, Samantha or Kelly, so that we can kind of have things in our brain when we meet early in June to work out the schedule. And then of course we'll be all together again at the end of June, the last Thursday in June at 2 o'clock.
And I would just add to thank you, Kristen. I would just add that I think that one of the most valuable reasons to do this kind of group thing is to share your successes. And don't be shy about, you know, hey, I did this. And in fact, I just completely disregarded what Rich said, but went with something else. And this worked. You know, I think we all want to hear it. And I particularly would like to hear it if I made a suggestion and it helped. But it doesn't have to be that way. And don't be shy about talking about the situations you have, either good or bad. I think the group mind is often the most valuable.
This is Kelly with Plan. I'm just going to give one more quick plug. Tomorrow is the deadline for workshop proposals for the 2021 statewide training conference, which at this current moment, we are planning to hold as an in-person event, possibly offering some kind of hybrid options. So I will be sending a reminder out by email today after this call. So please, if you have any suggestions, if you have a session you'd like to propose for you or another presenter, please send them in by tomorrow's deadline. We don't have all that many proposals right now, and that makes it an uphill battle for me. So I'm begging for your help. Please submit proposals. Okay, anybody have anything else? Okay, thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Take care, be well.
Thanks,
Take
guys.
care.